Yeah.
I wish I had a microphone.
Okay, we're gonna do this one.
Sorry. So welcome to the Mira Godard Gallery, everyone. Happy Saturday afternoon. And today we're here for a very happy occasion to celebrate the new exhibition of prints by Richard York. And if you see one of these on the way out, there's a beautiful essay written by Dr. Eva Seidner, who is with us also here today. And I love the opening line where you say, you know, I have a guilty secret that I don't actually read the labels, I look at the art first. And I think I encourage you all to do that.
Not secret anymore.
So, I guess the format is you're going to discuss the prints downstairs, and we're all eager to hear.
Well, welcome everybody. It's so nice to have a full house. This is fabulous. Yes, I'm Eva Seidner, and I am delighted to be here to talk about these prints because I've seen the process. I watched them in the making. It was a long, laborious, very inspired process, so we're very lucky to have Richard sharing that with us today. I guess I'm here because I've been following Richard's work for about 12 years now. It was a late summer day in 2012. It was a Sunday afternoon, and my husband Michael and I barged into Richard's gallery even though it was officially closed to visitors on a Sunday. And Richard, being very gracious, showed us around anyway. And I was just so enthused and fascinated by what I saw that we just kept coming back and watching the expansion of this language of color woodblock printing and marveling at the experiments. And this is a great culmination of 12 years of printmaking, although Richard's been making prints for how many years?
On and off for 40 probably.
40 years. So I think he's got it down. But you'll see when you go and have another look. We both, as John mentioned, we both contributed essays to the present catalog for this show. And I also had the pleasure of writing about his work previously for a group show called 2020 Spirit Doubles, which fortuitously opened the day that COVID announced its presence in the world. But I had an opportunity to write about two other prints that were completely different from what we're going to be seeing today. I just want to say before we get started, I have prepared a number of questions in case you were a silent crowd, but I don't think you're going to be. I recognize a lot of people here. But I thought that instead of treating this as a formal interview Q&A situation, we would just have the pleasure of another collective studio visit. So if any of you have questions or comments or anything occurs to you along the way, please feel free to speak up. Is that okay with you? I didn't ask you. So just to get us started, I know that you've been fascinated with color woodblock printing for a very long time, and I just want to ask you to tell us the source of that fascination. And specifically, all the prints that we're seeing downstairs are reduction color woodblocks, which seems to me to be the most unforgiving mode of woodblock printing. So why reduction color woodblock prints?
Well, to take the first part first. When I was a teenager, I saw a show of Durer's woodcuts at the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento, in California.
Richard, you're going to have to speak up.
Okay. I saw an exhibit of Durer's woodcuts at the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento back in the late 70s, early 80s, I think. And I just was fascinated with the texture and how the complexity of the woodcuts were, you know, carving it from a piece of wood. So that's what got me interested, and after that I discovered the German Expressionist woodcuts and Munch, and I kind of went down a rabbit hole with Munch for a while, and just taught myself basically how to do woodcuts from that. So it was an experiment, and I would use that as a guide, and that's why I got into that.
And there's still a lot of expressionism in the prints that we're seeing downstairs, so that's interesting.
For
Yeah.
that one right there.
Right, right. And the reduction technique?
The reduction, my mother had a bunch of art books, and there was an old art book of Picasso's liner cuts, reduction liner cuts. And in that they showed, they didn't have the original stages of the print, but they just electronically
Right.
made it look like what it was. So that kind of intrigued me to work backwards. And Picasso only worked in 2 or 3 colors usually. And initially that's what I did, but then I just kept pushing more and more color.
Would it have been more difficult with the woodblock than, I mean, lino cuts are a different language in a way.
When my hands are tired, I do liner cuts because it's easier to
Oh.
carve and get the kind of circuitous marks that you want to get.
Right.
It's a lot harder in wood because you're fighting the grain.
Right.
But that's a challenge. So.
And you love the grain.
Yeah.
I always say that Richard's lost in the wood. Because sometimes you actually see the wood grain coming through the color, and it is part of what makes the print look so active. So, you know, bless you. So it really kind of pulls you into the image, and that's the movement of the image. You mentioned
That's because
Sacramento.
sometimes I'll sand the block a little bit.
So
to
you
raise
want,
the
you
grain.
want that to come through.
After I've carved it.
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned Sacramento, and I'd like to ask you about the idea of West in your work. We know this series is called West Wind, of course, because of Tom Thomson, but you're someone who spent most of your life in the West, first California and then BC.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if there's anything about the West, if there's any West-inflected, anything discernible in your work about, the topography, the quality of the light, cultures of the West. So,
I was born in Wisconsin, so I was, I don't really remember that much about it because my parents moved to California when I was 9. So really, I remember going over the Rockies, and I remember California. So the West, I don't think I could live anywhere but the West. I like it. It's just become part of who I am and how I approach things. So all of the prints have some kind of reference to the West, even though
You're talking to each other, not to me.
where are you? I'm sorry.
Back of the hall, Eva.
back at home.
Angle
So-
our chairs towards.
Yeah, we need louder.
Louder, yeah.
Okay.
You can yell at us.
Okay. You first.
Yeah, stand.
Well, the West is always an interesting concept for me. Growing up in the States, as a kid, you're ingrained with all these things they teach you about manifest destiny and all this other stuff. But in the 60s, I sort of felt like there was no more West to go to after that. And so it was more west of the mind, that whole 60s
Right.
San Francisco sort of approach to things. And I just find it a pretty fascinating topic. And how do you do that visually?
So could we discern that in some of the prints?
There's a lot of green and a lot of blues in these different.
So it's color. We're going to talk a lot about color because obviously in color woodblock printing that's important, but I think that in Richard's images in particular, color has a very, it's a very emotive quality. I think there are also meanings associated with colors, and the whole expressionist sense that you get from a lot of them has a lot to do with the combination of colors. Are we coming through at the back now?
Barely.
Barely?
Barely.
Okay.
You should stand.
I can't, unfortunately, I
Oh,
can't.
how about moving forward?
Yeah, we can do
All the way
that.
forward.
You promise that you won't hit us. Yeah.
Well, when you have a whole world around you that's blue and green, basically, you want to use other colors. And so I don't try to use colors as they really appear. So I'm trying to offset the blue and the green with other colors. So I like yellow and reds and purples and oranges. And you see a lot of that in these prints. They aren't Thomson's colors necessarily. They're more post-impressionists. And because I kind of felt like he was going that direction. And so I just took it a bit in a few extremes more. And then the other part, let's see. Did I say why reduction? Well, reduction woodcuts I'm fascinated with because you're working reverse and backwards. So a lot of people that watch the process, you try to explain the process to them. My mind must be wired some way different because you're basically, it's not an additive process, it's a subtractive process. So the way I do it is I do the backgrounds first, thinking, and usually you would do light to dark. And so I'd normally do that, but then I also throw in and mix around different colors. So you do the background, then you do the middle ground, and you do the foreground. So it helps to organize your thoughts and what colors you're going to use, sort of working this way to the front of the print. So it's using the space in a different way. What I liked about Thomson's compositions is that he used stack perspective for the most part, which means things that are closer is in the lower third of the frame. Things that are in the middle ground are in the middle, and things in the background are in the back. And I've always done that with all the prints that I do, because that's part of the woodcut process, the reduction process that I do. So I chose different sketches of his to sort of illuminate and make that point more apparent. So if you look at the prints, you'll see that there's stacked perspectives. There's not a lot of 1 or 2 point perspective going on.
I think it's also interesting to note that these blocks are self-canceling blocks. I know you've explained that in other shows, but as you work, you actually cut away the block. So there's no going back to correct a color or to clarify anything that you might not have been satisfied with. Once it's cut away, it's gone. And so at the end, you're left with a canceled block. There's no need for the artist to kind of put a big X through the block so that no one can print from it again, because there is nothing to print from. And that strikes me as, that's very brave.
They also call them suicide prints. Because if you make a mistake, I mean, you could put wood filler in and try and sand it and make it look, but I just sort of, if whatever happens, happens. It's just part of the print. So.
I love that term, because when I was writing the essay, I thought, well, is it the suicide of the block, or is it the suicide of the artist who thinks, oh, shit, I have to start again? Because there's no going back. So.
Well, luckily my aesthetic doesn't
allow for.
I'm not a perfectionist, so it isn't not a big deal.
I'd like to move on to Tom Thomson, and we already had a question here in the front about Tom Thomson. Specifically, I'm interested in the whole myth making, the whole myth around Tom Thomson, who I was saying to Richard yesterday seems to stand over Canadian landscape art the way Paul Bunyan stands over America. You know, he's a giant. And it seemed to me at first that this would be a very daunting undertaking, to use Tom Thomson's plein air oil sketches as a sort of jumping off point for Richard making his own statements. Can you talk a little bit about, actually there is a print here on the upper left, which to me is the myth. It's called myth making. And what we see is not just a really handsome, hot guy baiting a fish hook, but he seems to stand for Canadian wilderness itself. He's rugged, he's strong, he's handsome. And there is a myth of Tom Thomson that always seems to surround his work. People who don't even know about the Group of Seven being formed after Tom Thomson's death know the myth of Tom Thomson, the great outdoorsman. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that myth started and the kind of shadow that it casts?
I always liked Thomson's sketches, and they were intriguing to me much more so than the studio paintings that he did. because those had more technique, more polish, but they didn't have that kind of spark that the sketches had. And when I moved to Canada and started learning about Canadian artists more than I knew, Thomson always stood out to me as being sort of the foremost painter that I attracted my eye. And I just was kind of fascinated with the myth. I kind of view him as being the James Dean of Canadian art. It's that idea of unrealized potential that everybody, there's something lost there that maybe we look for that part of things, adventure that's missing in our life, I don't know. But those paintings of Thomson's to me are like mood poems. So he's creating a mood in each one of those sketches. And there's a little bit of narrative there. I like narrative. And I was trying to recapture that because each of the sketches sort of give you a whole view of Algonquin Park from my point of view. It's like, it's his Winesburg, Ohio, with little short stories that comprise, a whole novel. Well, that's a novel for me of Algonquin Park. So the myths, he was when he passed away, I really feel like Lauren Harris and J.E.H. MacDonald sort of saw in him and his work what they wanted their art to be, and so they basically created his career and the myth about him, which helped what they wanted to achieve too. But
Which was a new language of Canadian landscape painting,
Yeah.
right? That wasn't British and wasn't a sort of tepid reiteration of what they saw in European art, or particularly in British art.
But I didn't want to get into the group of 7 stuff really. I wanted to focus on those moods. And so the 14 prints that you'll see down there are selected to show different color palettes, different moods, different scenes.
I was going to ask you how you picked, I mean, Thomson made more than 400 of these tiny sketches, and if you've seen the show at the McMichael, they're quite small. They don't look anything like what we have downstairs, particularly except that the scene is your jumping off point. And out of the 400, how did you settle on these particular images? What was
They're
it?
just ones that attracted me and ones that I thought I could turn into woodcuts.
Right. So
That,
so it
that
was
would, I could see a path to the end. Some of them were more complex, and I wasn't quite certain what I would do with that. But of these particular ones, I could see a way forward with it. So.
right.
And out of all of that was sort of a thought experiment that what if Tom Thomson had made woodcuts between 1914 and 1917? What might they have looked like? Because there really wasn't any Canadian artists doing woodcuts in that time period. I know Phillips started about 1916, 1917
They're very different.
with
looking,
his,
right? His-
yeah, they're more traditional,
Quite Japanese.
Japanese looking.
Yeah.
The first one he did was called Winter,
Yeah.
which is pretty. But in terms of, I think J.E.H. MacDonald did one of Algoma Park, like a beaver pond,
Mhm.
that I don't think it was ever edition. You see a couple prints pop up on different art things. But, so I thought, well, what if he had the technique? What might it have looked like to begin with? So this is the first print that I did that was just imagining that if he was sitting in a tent and it was raining and he couldn't paint anything that day, he just took a board and sketched what he saw out the flaps of the tent and carved away everything but his sketch and inked it with some oil paint. That's actually red oil paint. And put a piece of paper on it and printed it.
With a spoon.
Rubbed it back with a spoon.
Right.
And that was the idea of that, but that wasn't complex. I mean, that's sort of the look of what the J.H. MacDonald print would have been. So then I started to think, organize things in terms of what were the styles 1914 and 1917 in woodcuts. So in the white line woodcut, which is this, there were Provincetown printmakers in Massachusetts who we're trying to find a way to do Japanese-style woodcuts, color woodcuts, but without having to cut a block for each color. So they basically drew their sketch on the block and carved away their drawing, and then they used watercolor to brush on the block and fold the paper over and rub the back with a spoon. And so that was the first one of that. And then I did another sort of expressionistic. This is from one of Thomson's photos of 7 fish that he had caught or something. And so I did an expressionist one there. I did this one portrait. And then I think I did Logjam, which is more of a vorticist print. It's more abstracted. I'll get some here.
It's interesting because Harris did say that it was Thomson that was pushing towards, towards modernism, right? He said he was becoming a bit cubist, and he was.
So this is more like an English vorticist, Edward Wadsworth or any of the like during World War I period, 3 colors. And but all of these were interesting, and they probably were the kind of print that Thomson would have done if he didn't have a lot of woodcut experience. But that wasn't what I wanted to do for the show. So this was the first print that kind of had the feel of, I think this is like 15 colors or something. And once it was closer to the look I was going for, but because of the size, this is, closer to what his sketch is, just a little bit bigger than that. I wanted to have a bigger impact, so I had to have a bigger scale and do a bigger print.
Right.
So the show is the result of the bigger print.
I heard a gasp from this group when you said there were 15 colors on that little piece of paper. So I want to talk a little bit about color and ask you about that. I was astonished myself, even though I've watched this process, to find that some of these prints have 20, 22, 23 colors on them, which I imagine is as much as a paper can support printing. How much
Well,
more
the
can
paper
you
starts
do?
out pretty light, and by the time you get done with it,
It's heavy. It's a heavy
yeah.
print. So I have a number of questions about that. I had started to ask you before about the emotive qualities of color. I don't know if you want to talk more about that. Colors can be symbolic, whether it's Piero della Francesca's Madonnas in blue and white, or whether you're looking at expressionist work. What are you hoping to elicit from viewers by deeply layering and saturating so much color?
I like the juxtaposition of color. In my late teens, early 20s, I went to see at the Berkeley Art Museum. There was a big exhibit of Franz Marc. And the blue horses, I don't know if everybody knows that painting. But when you're standing in front of it, the colors vibrate off each other. And it just kind of, you can feel it in your chest. And I just was always fascinated with that concept of how 2 colors together can just give you energy and response. So really, that's always been. When I use shop towels that have their blue color, and when you're wiping the block off after you do it and the ink comes on it, and you get these really fascinating blends of color that you go, okay. So they're color explorations as much as anything, and how the different colors work together.
So I'm interested in how you know when you're done. I had heard an interview with Gerhard Richter, who was talking about these monumental wall-size canvases, which he made by pulling a squeegee either vertically or horizontally along the canvas. And he just kept pulling until the painting was done, and they're totally abstract, so you don't really, it would be hard for me to understand how he'd know he was finished. And the interviewer said, well, how do you know when you should stop pulling the squeegee across the canvas? And Richter said, I stop when I can't do any more. And what that suggests to me is that it's not the artist who decides when the work is done. It's the work of art itself that declares itself finished. So if the work decides it's finished, you stop. But you went to 23 colors, and I'm wondering, did the work ever say to you, okay, you've said everything that you can say for this particular image? Or how did you know?
It always does that. Plus, you're running out of space on the block. You
Oh.
cut everything away, but
Right.
there are a couple times, I know my wife will tell me that she likes it right there,
Right.
and I got to where I don't let anybody look at it because they like that stage, and then I put more color over it, and then it takes that effect away. So you really have to wait till the end, and it's an evolving process where I'm not really deciding the colors until I'm putting them on, till I know what's already there, and then
So you don't have a completed image in your mind. You just keep going until it feels like it's
with
done.
the Thomson things, I mostly use sketches for the design, the compositions, and then I would reference sort of the color palette he used, but then I would just let the print go and follow what went with the previous colors I'd laid down and where did I want to take it from there.
Right, so you've said that you were never trying to replicate his color, so that was interesting to me, because obviously
Especially in
you're
a
not.
print like Pink Birches down there.
Yes, yeah,
That just took on a life of its own.
right, and it melts into abstraction
Yeah.
at some point. I mean, there's a lot of abstraction in that print.
Well, I like the border between representation and abstraction. And some of those, I wanted to do one of the prints, one of the nocturnes that Thomson did. That's it's purples and dark blues, and it's very abstractive, but
Right.
I never got that far. But,
Well, there's something of that in Northern Light, right?
yeah, but that's more representational.
Right.
So Richard, you're not trying to replicate the sketches themselves,
No, I'm trying to replicate the mood.
the mood? Okay.
But not the colors and like in Pink Birches, on the tree trunks, there's the patterns. It was during when I was getting firewood in the firewood pile that I have, and the bark would come off, and there were beetles and termites had eaten underneath the bark, and it had that kind of pattern. Well, that's in the tree trunks, if you look at Pink Birches.
That's so interesting. I thought that was an Emily Carr kind of native motif.
No, but it ended up being that.
But it looks like that. It does
Well, you
look
wonder
like
where
that.
all those came. She might have,
That's true.
yeah, I don't know. But it's just using that, how can I create the mood, push it to sort of a post-impressionist color. I like the Nabi color palettes. So I was trying, since Thomson I felt was sort of going that way, I was taking it to that extra degree of color. So.
That's interesting. Since you're talking about painting, I want to ask you about this term painterly print. That's in the catalog essay. What was my question? First of all, what does the term mean? What do you mean by a painterly print? And why do you want the cuts that you made to the wood to somehow recall brushwork? What does it add to the
Well,
color wood block that you're
A
making?
painterly print, if you look at most woodcuts, they stop at a certain point, they have a certain look, and everybody says, well, that's a woodcut, and they kind of look at it and go beyond that. I wanted to sort of push the language a bit more and push the amount of color and everything involved with it. So a painterly print, there was a show at the Met in the 80s, I think, that was called a painterly print, and it had to do with monotypes. So in that regard, monotypes being, because you see the brush strokes and you're doing all of that, but it was influential in the early modernism with Morris Prendergast and Degas and all these people doing monotypes. I wanted to kind of get that feel of what those monotypes, painterly prints look like with a woodcut. And so how do I achieve that? So over the years, I've been slowly trying to use painterly techniques of mixing impasto gel and other things with to glaze, using layers of ink to glaze so it looks like a painting, and a variety of things. But in this case, since Thomson's sketches were so flowing and you could see the brush strokes and that was all part of the feel of it, I was trying to figure out, well, how do I do a painterly
Cut. Right.
with carving on the woodcut? So in the essay in the catalog, I talk about finally hitting upon, I always liked the Roy Lichtenstein paintings from 1962, 63, which were brushstrokes. And they were from a comic book that he did a painting from a particular comic book. But I always liked the flow of that. It had an elegance to it. And how in his painting, how the bristles go off and you're depicting that. And so I was trying to do that in carving the woodcut and inking it.
Wow.
And then when you mix that with, there was a wood engraver in the 1880s, 1890s, Auguste Lepere in France. And he had a particular way of carving to get halftones, to get the grays in his wood engravings that would, when you're printing it from one color. And I always liked, if you blow up these little figures he has, you can see the tones. So on a lot of prints, there's elements of that in there too. So it was a blending of that too to try to achieve a brush stroke of it. So hopefully it works.
That's ambitious. That's hugely ambitious. Well, since you mentioned Lepere, I wasn't going to go into this, but you've also said in your essay that after World War II there was a sort of falling off in the stature of woodblock printing as an art form, that it was considered to be sort of outmoded, passé, it was no longer interesting. And yet, I mean, we've got examples of Lepere and Duret and Munch and all these people who made fabulous woodcuts. I'm just thinking of course I'm thinking of Emil Orlik because I do that, but there were woodblock revivals in Europe and obviously in North America. There were colonies in California. Is there a Canadian version of a woodblock revival in the Canadian art? Has there ever been an interest in reviving the color woodblock?
Yeah, I would have expected it to have started much earlier than the 20s. So really it began with Phillips and Edwin Holgate and a few Carl Schaefer and different people. But I started to research what was the woodcut scene in Canada, and I really only found, there were a few books. There was a show at the Glenbow in the 80s, Images of the Land. I don't know if people know that. There was a catalog published. And luckily it was in the library on Salt Spring where I lived, so I could...
a lot of artists on Salt Spring, right?
I could access that. So that was the most thorough recounting of all the different artists that were involved.
So it's not really a movement, though, in Canada as it was in Europe, is it? I mean...
No, not like... The woodcut revival came out of Japanismo, out of the whole ukiyo-e woodcuts that were brought into France in 1850s and 1860s,
and avidly collected by Impressionists and Post-Impressionists.
Monet and Van Gogh and everybody.
Right.
Van Gogh painted a couple paintings that were basically Japanese woodcuts that he did. And he didn't know the text, so he just picked something off of something and did that.
They had a vast collection of Japanese prints.
Which the Van Gogh Museum still has.
Right.
The majority of them.
So it seems to have fallen from a very high stature in the sort of canon of art making.
It spread all over the world. It spread into the U.S. At one point there were 2,000 printmakers making prints, woodcuts and liner cuts in the 20s and the 30s. But really the Depression, all the color woodcuts everybody was doing, they started, the only people were having shows showing social protest, 30s kind of black and white. So they couldn't get the color prints in shows or published. And then World War II happened, and after the war, everything was, abstract expressionism,
Right,
modernism.
because the center of art moved from Europe to New York, basically.
Now, there was Stanley Hayter's Atelier 17. So a few of the printers that were abstract painters also did some abstract expressionist woodcuts, but they weren't popular.
Nobody got it. Nobody really.
No, I mean,
knew what they were.
you can find them online, and
Right.
Warner Drews and a few other people that did those, but it wasn't, the only person who's really achieved any really big notice with it was Helen Frankenthaler.
Who was basically making Japanese
Yeah.
woodcuts
And
in Japan.
There were a couple print centers, one of them in San Francisco and one in New York, and then I think there was somebody in Los Angeles, but they were inviting bigger name artists like Wayne Thiebaud and Francisco Clemente and all these different people in the 80s to supply a drawing or a sketch or something, and they had a deal, this thing with a printmaker in, I think in Kyoto. And so he would carve all the blocks for these prints. They would go over for 2 weeks and work with them and just pick colors and make sure it's what they wanted. And he'd print them up and then they'd sell them. Well, the owner of Equinox Gallery, I think in Vancouver, wanted to do that similar thing for Mary Pratt. So Mary Pratt did the, yeah.
Right.
So that's Masao Arakushi, who was a printmaker in Vancouver, who basically did her prints and did Tanabe's woodcuts. You see Tanabe's stamp and his stamp on the woodcuts.
But what is he doing now?
But then he couldn't make a living at that. He was a sushi chef.
Yes, I mean,
But he's still alive. He lives outside of Vancouver. But his son is in Toronto. His son's in Toronto. He's a jazz guitarist
no, that's good.
that does Django Reinhardt
Oh,
music. So
we should all go.
yeah.
Great. So how do you see yourself in that context? Are you going to start a
Well, I was trying
revival
to have woodcuts have the stature of paintings
Right.
and sculptures or anything else, because if you just left it at the stage it was at before the war, that's kind of boring. You have Helen Frankenthaler's thing, but she was a big name already, so
Right.
I'm trying to just create, that's why I do the painted prints and try and push.
Expand the language
Yeah.
of the woodblock.
Yeah.
My questions are all out of order, so I don't know what to ask next.
Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. You go ahead. Oh, God. I'm curious about your use of texture and how you use texture to kind of recreate that tone that you so
Well,
love.
if you think of Thompson's paintings are mood poems, so it's what's he using for word choice, like you would create for a mood. So it's those textures and the brush strokes and things in the paintings are creating the mood. It's the little signature things that are like equivalent of a word. So how do you recreate that in a woodcut? It's mixing tones, it's allowing colors to show through, it's trying to always put movement into, because most woodcuts are pretty static.
Yeah.
So how do you convey movement? So if you notice there's a lot of curvilinear flowing lines, and that's that Emily Carr idea of there's a lifeline through things that just flow. And so I'm always trying to have that kind of flow going. So it's a bit like Jackson Pollock's paintings, where you can enter at any point and there's a flow around to it and exit where you want. But hopefully the way you put color in different areas and things, it's always drawing your eye around. So there's always movement going.
Thank you.
I do things in threes. So there's always like 3 colors spread over, or 3 things. One big thing there was a book called Composition by Arthur Wesley Dow. It was one of the first color woodblock promoters. He taught at Columbia University. He wrote a book called Composition in about 1896. And George O'Keeffe was a student of his, and Arthur Dow and a bunch of people, Max Weber. So he would always talk about composition, repetition, the use of line and light and dark and color. And so all of those things are always in the back of my mind. And texture is a big thing. So I use an etching press, a big etching press, and so with blankets on top, so all these prints are embossed. If you look at the back of the print, you can see all the embossing from it. And that was a ukiyo-e thing. They would often have like the flowers on a kimono around the waist and things, and they would carve it, but they wouldn't ink it. And it was one of the last things you do when you printed it, then was to get that feel, that texture to it.
Richard,
George.
congratulations. It's great, your exploration of Thomson's work. You've reinterpreted and you've reevaluated it on a different level. And Eva, the essay is brilliant too. Thank you. My question is about a bit about your painterly approach to printmaking, which I find fascinating. And you talk about, using the brush as well for the prints. But one of the things I'm interested in is how the image is reversed. You don't talk about that element. The thing about the painter is they take the brush and they put it on the canvas, and that's not a reflection, it's an immediate right reading. Whereas when you do something, it's reversed. And surprisingly, west wind is going the right way, which means this is an important part of your process, is how it is reversed when that's not a natural thing and is not a painterly thing. It's something that's unique to the graphic process of relief printmaking. If you could speak to that, please.
If all of you know George writes backwards. I don't know. I think it becomes part of your thought process, right? But you have to envision it in reverse. So you have to take your sketch and reverse it on the block. And because in that case, with 23 colors, you basically have to use an India ink or a Sharpie to make sure it's something that when you wipe the first layers of the color off, it doesn't take the drawing with you. And so one of the things I do is I take pictures as I'm progressing every day so that I can look at it and then look at what I'm going to carve and get it in your head, so going the reverse. Does that make sense? It becomes intuitive after a while, I think, but when I was first doing it, I had to really work. And then sometimes you have those fortuitous accidents that said, okay, and then you develop a language of your own that sort of proceeds out of that.
You don't have that problem with the Japanese printing technique, right? Because there's the artist's image that's then not upside down.
They would do the
face down.
They do the key block first.
Right.
And then they'd print them on a bunch of prints. And then they would take each of those prints back to the artist, and he would color in what color he wanted in what area. And then they would take those and glue them down to a block and then carve away everything that wasn't that color. And then they would marry them together. Well, I don't like carving 25 blocks just to do one thing. So the reduction process really allows me to deal that many colors and keep it all straight.
It's environmentally correct.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't waste the
Have you
block.
kept photographs of blocks before you started to?
Yeah.
Yeah, because that'd be sort of interesting to see.
In the catalog, you see every
Yeah.
stage
Uh-huh.
of the West Wind here.
Yeah.
And then you see the block, which is the finished.
Yeah.
So that's the finished block.
Yeah.
So the blocks are as pretty as the prints usually. These are on birch veneered painting panels. So the actual surface is only about 1/4 of an inch thick, which even limited because I can't carve very deep. So I was doing a color a day, basically, and trying to leave areas. So you had a lot of, after you've inked it, you had a lot of cleanup on the areas that were lower to make sure that but sometimes that gives a little extra effect to it and texture to it too. So.
A little more mundane, you moved from the States to Canada, then to Salt Spring. I mean, how has that affected what you do and why you do it?
Well, I did printmaking in California when I was a kid, but there wasn't really an outlet for it, for the kind of prints I was doing then. And I got involved in television and I got sidetracked with things. I was a photographer for a while. And I knew when my wife and I would move to Salt Spring, we picked a spot on Salt Spring that was along the road where the ferry comes in, so I could have a studio and a gallery there. And that kind of, I had written a documentary for PBS about the environmental history of California that ran in 2015. So I was interested in the environment and other things, so I wanted to do prints that sort of took this new, I think I viewed the Pacific Northwest with new eyes because I hadn't lived on this island, and then I started doing all my imagery off of Salt Spring to begin with. And it evolved from that. I like the landscape in the Pacific Northwest. And between Emily Carr and Tanabe, and there's this whole, those are the two extremes of the different kinds of, but there's all this stuff in the middle of that, and I'm trying to tap into that. So when I've lived here, I had a pretty thorough grounding in American art and European art, but I really hadn't been exposed to that much Canadian art. And so I've been here 15 years now. So my goal was to immerse myself in Canadian art and what the relief print history was. And that's where I became interested in how the evolution of woodcuts in Canada. And George back there is one of the great Canadian wood engravers, so, with his woodcut novels. So,
Including Tom Thomson.
including Tom Thomson. I purposely didn't look at George's book. I bought it, but I didn't want to be influenced by it until after. I've looked at it a lot now.
Great.
Yeah, I'm interested in why the history took so long. You know, there was wood engraving, and
Right.
Grip had wood engravers that did commercial newspaper ads and things. But it wasn't really an art form that anybody was working in for fine art. So, which is always a kind of a curious thing. Why didn't it evolve that early when there was a lot of examples?
Well, there was a market that was British obsessed.
Yeah.
So if you can't sell it, you know, it's difficult to keep going if nobody is. That's what I saw when I was looking at Tom Thomson's really resolved paintings, when he took one of these oil sketches and turned it into a big picture that you could put over your fireplace or over your sofa or whatever they had in 1900. It loses all its energy. It's as if it's just it becomes almost decorative, except it is Tom Thomson. So of course there's something magnificent about it, but it becomes so careful, and you have the sense that the artist is holding back because he needs to sell this picture in order to finance his life as an artist in the bush. So I think a lot of it must have had to do with the market. If people weren't interested in a new language or a new vision, which was also something this is my last question. Are we okay for another question? Is everybody? I'll ask it then. Which is the transcendental content, if that's how you see it, of Thomson's approach to landscape painting, because you're not responding to landscape, you're responding to Thomson's rendition of landscape. And it was a time when all these transcendental ideas were in the air, right? Spiritualism, cheaper versions of transcendentalism, but spiritualism was
Right.
part of that. We know
Yeah.
that at the Arts and Letters Club, all the group of 7 were summoning spirits. Is any of that energy from Thomson's small sketches present in these color woodblock prints? It's hard, huh? Sorry.
Well, it is present. I'll give you background of. I was always fascinated with my grandfather and my grandfather's time period, and I never knew him because he died in 1949. But he was of Thomson's generation, so he was in World War I. He was a fisherman. He read Emerson. So all these things. So I was liked Emerson, and I liked Thoreau, and in the 60s, and when I was going to school in the 70s, Thoreau still wasn't a dirty word, you know, which he's sort of become more now. But I just was always fascinated with the art of the 20s and the 30s, and especially, you know, Arthur Dove and all these other people that were part of Stieglitz's gallery and all that. So that period with Thomson and the nature aspect of it, with my background and the documentary and all these things, it's always had kind of that appeal to see the spiritual nature. Now I know that's 100 years ago, but still it's pretty an interesting aspect, that, just at least from my own personal viewpoint. And so that's why Thomson, another appeal to
That drew you to Thomson.
You know, it's I like romanticism. I like Caspar David Friedrich. I don't know that a lot of work that I've done has a Rücken figure in the back.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what a Rücken figure is? It was a pictorial convention of the Romanticists where you would see somebody from the back looking at a landscape. Mm-hmm. So wander in the clouds or whatever, that one Caspar David Friedrich. But also the monk on the beach. I don't know if anybody's ever seen Monk on the Beach. It's this huge painting, and he's just this insignificant little person on the beach. And it's really an abstract word. It's huge. So a lot of prints I've done have done that, and it involves that kind of relationship. Rücken figure is where you're the viewer viewing another viewer viewing this landscape, and so you're a bit of a voyeur,
Right,
but it's also
because the Rücken is the German word for back,
Yeah.
right? So you're
Yeah.
looking at the back of the viewer.
So they aren't always solitary ones. In Friedrich, there are women that are sitting on hills looking at the sunset with ships off in the background. And I always liked those paintings, but I didn't realize that my great-grandmother was born on the island where those paintings were done, which was kind of weird. So there's some kind of connection there. When Linda and I went to Rügen Island in 2019, it was like a weird kind of like, I've been here, I'm coming home kind of thing. So it's kind of an odd, but I like that kind of approach.
So can I ask you what's next? Do you have a sense of what's next?
I want to keep pushing the painterly print idea, but I'm not sure where that's going to go. I want to do more British Columbia landscapes with that and see where it goes. But
2 years from now.
yeah.
Any other questions, comments?
Yeah.
I notice too that, you know, you've spoken at length about the medium explorations you're doing and the dialogue with the landscape. But you're also taking on Tom Thomson, like an iconic painter. And
Pushes you to get better.
yeah.
Same thing with musicians. Musicians love to play with better musicians because it forces them to let go and just intuitively go where to let the restrictions that you would have behind, right? So dealing with Thomson, I just had to use. I just kind of jumped in with both feet and went for it with these big prints, and wasn't afraid to use whatever colors I wanted to use, try to create brush strokes. They were either going to work or they weren't going to work. But that was part of the exploration. I was going to say, Northrop Frye said of Thomson that he and Emily Carr were the artist explorers of Canadian art. And so once I did this, I understood what he was saying with that. It wasn't just that they were always looking beyond the next, bunch of islands or tree behind the trees. It was they were pushing themselves to do something. Emily Carr was painting. She didn't have any money. She was painting on newsprint basically, with gasoline thinning her paints in Douglas Park. So, and it gives people who are restoring her stuff a nightmare because the paper's falling apart and it was using gasoline. So, it's pushing the techniques to get what you wanted to say and just worrying about letting those barriers behind. So hopefully there's a feeling of that in this. Yeah.
Very good. Okay, are there any more questions? No? Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much for coming. And now we can, Richard, that was absolutely fascinating. And the questions were really digging. I love that. It wasn't